Jayam Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parvajakacharya Astatar Sata Sri Srimad His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Jai Anantakoti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai ISKCON Founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai Gaura Premananda. All glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to Sri Sri Guru and Gauranga, glories to Srila Prabhupada. Om Vishnu Padaya Christmas. Bhaktivedanta Swami Tanamane Namaste Saraswati Deve Shesha Shanivadi Paschata Satarane. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 2, Chapter 10, Bhagavatam is the answer to all questions, text 19. Vivakshor, Mukato, Bhumno, Vanir, Vag, Vyahritam, Tayo, Jale, Chaitasya, Sucharam, Niruda, Samajayata, Vivakshor Mukato Bhumno, Vanirvag Vyahritam Tayaho, Jale Chaitasya Sucharam, Nirodha Samajayata, Vivakshor Mukato Bhumno, Vanirvag Vyahritam Tayaho, Jale Chaitasya Sucharam, Nirodha Samajayata, Vivakshor Mukato Bhumno, Vanirvag Vyahritam Tayaho, Jale Chaitasya Suchiram, Nirodha Samajayata. Vivakshor Mukato Bhumno, Ayyanandvayo, Jale Chaitasya Suchiram, Nirodha Samajayata, Vivakshor Mukato Bhumno, Suchiram, Samajayata, Mukato Bhumno, Ayurveda Samsayo, Jale Chaitasya Suchiram, Vaishnavis, Vivakshor Mukato Bhumno, Ayurveda Samsayo, Suchiram, Ramajayata, Vivaksha Mukata Bhumla Anyabhavanasaya Anyasya Suchiram Asamajayata Asamukata Bhumla Anyabhavanasaya Saraya Charitasya Suchiram Vaksham Mugata Bhumla Ahaya Ninatham Saram Ahaya Vivakshaho. When there was a need to speak, Mukataha, from the mouth, Bhumnaha, of the Supreme, Vanihi, fire, or the controlling deity of fire, Vak, vibration, Vyahritam, speeches, Tayoho, by both, Jale, in the water, Cha, however, Etasya, of all these, Sucharam, a very, very long time, Nirodha, suspension, Samajayata, did continue. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Translation. When the Supreme desired to speak, speeches were vibrated from the mouth. Then the controlling deity, fire, was generated from the mouth. But when the Supreme was lying in the water, all these functions remained suspended. Purport. The peculiarity of the gradual development of the different senses is simultaneously supported by their controlling deities. It is to be understood, therefore, that the activities of the sense organs are controlled by the will of the Supreme. The senses are, so to speak, offering a license for the conditioned souls who are to use them properly under the control of the controlling deity deputed by the Supreme Lord. One who violates such controlling regulations has to be punished by degradation to a lower status of life. Consider, for example, the tongue and its controlling deity Varuna. The tongue is meant for eating, and men, animals, and birds each have their different taste because of different licenses. The taste of human beings and that of the swine are not on the same level. The controlling deity, however, awards or certifies a particular type of body when the particular living entity develops a taste in terms of different modes of nature. If the human being develops taste without discrimination, as does the swine, then the controlling deity is certainly certified for the next term to award him the body of a swine. The swine accepts any kind of foodstuff, including stools, and a human being who has developed such indiscriminate taste must be prepared for a degraded life in the next life. Such a life is also God's grace, because the conditioned soul desired a body like that for perfectly tasting a particular type of foodstuff. If a man gets the body of a swine, it must be understood, it must be considered the grace of the Lord, because the Lord awards the facility. After death, the next body is offered by superior control, not blindly. A human being, therefore, must be on his guard as to what sort of body he is going to have in the next life. An irresponsible life of indiscrimination is risky, and that is the declaration of all scriptures. Om Jnana Timirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaur Bhaktivinoda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So, this verse is part of a description of the universal form, the Virat Rupa. The Virat Rupa is providing a template for the action of the senses in the material body of the conditioned soul. Now, the conditioned souls are provided with material bodies because the spiritual body, the Swarupa, that each soul has, is meant only for loving devotional service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead in the spiritual world. It's not good for any other purpose. So therefore, when a soul comes to the material world, needs a material body in which to function here. So the Supreme Lord, understanding the different kinds of material desires that a conditioned soul may have, provides a full range of material bodies that are meant to satisfy the kinds of desires that each soul may have. So that is what is being described here. So this verse says, but when the Supreme was lying in the water, all of these functions remained suspended. This is described more fully in the description of the Virat Rupa, the universal form that's given in the third canto by Lord Kapila. There the same processes being described, how each sense is activated by the controlling deity that is associated with it. In this case, we see that the facility for speaking is controlled by the demigod in charge of fire. So that's kind of interesting that speech is associated with fire. Sometimes different personalities, they speak in a very fiery way. And it's kind of interesting how the word Vani, which means the instruction, particularly of the spiritual master, is associated with this demigod Vani, because that's what that word means according to Srila Prabhupada's synonyms here. Vani, fire, or the controlling deity of fire. So, but ultimately, Krishna is the controller of the demigods, who are the controllers of the senses. So ultimately, you could say Krishna is the controller of the senses, because Krishna is the source and the controller of the demigods. Krishna's name is sometimes given as Hrishikesha. So Hrishika means the senses, and Isha means the controller. So Krishna is known as Hrishikesh. So in the third canto description of the Virat Rupa, it's described that when each demigod enters the universal form and is associated with that sense, still the whole universal form, the whole Virat Rupa, does not become active. It's described one after another how, yes, the Vani, the controller of the sense of speech, he enters the body of the universal form and takes his station there. But still, the universal form isn't moving. And similarly, the demigod in charge of hearing and the demigods in charge of the other senses, they all enter the universal form, but the universal form does not become active. In other words, nothing happens in the universe. And as it's described in this verse, when the Supreme was lying in the water, all these functions remain suspended. So that's described in more detail. And it's not until consciousness and the demigod or the God in charge of consciousness enters the universal form that it becomes activated and everything begins to function in the universe. So it's described how in the Srimad Bhagavatam, how consciousness, mind, intelligence, and false ego are controlled by the Chaturvyuha expansion of Krishna, Vasudeva, Pradyumna, Aniruddha, and Sankarshan. So Sankarshan, which represents, from which Shiva expands, is in charge of false ego, and Aniruddha is in charge of the functions of the mind, and Pradyumna is in charge of the functions of intelligence, and Vasudeva is in charge of the function of consciousness. So I assume that means that Vasudeva has to be involved. And then the universal form, the Virat Rupa, begins to function, and the bodies of the living entities, the jivas, begin to function. So what is a body? Actually, it's a collection of senses. It's a collection of the working senses and knowledge-acquiring senses grouped around the mind, which is under the intelligence, and the whole apparatus is connected to the soul by false ego, false identification. Because the real identity of the soul is spirit soul. Jivaras Rupahoy Krishnera Nityadas. The real identity should be the Swarupa, the eternal spiritual body of the living entity, which is eternal servant of Krishna. But if one tries to enjoy independently, then one has to falsely identify with a collection of senses grouped around a mind, and with one's intelligence one tries to make use of that body and that one is connected to by false ego. If one is properly using one's intelligence, one will try to engage the senses in Krishna's service, and gradually one will come to understand, I am not this body. I am a spirit soul meant for the service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So, among the different forms that it is possible for the conditioned soul to identify with, the human form of life is considered most valuable, because in the human form of life, one has the ability to understand these things, to properly evaluate one's situation in the material world, and take up the process of devotional service, which qualifies one to eventually become liberated from the material world. Muktir hitvanyata, muktir hi, swarupena vivasati, swarupena vivasati. So the definition of liberation is that one ceases to identify with, to falsely identify with all these other different kinds of forms of bodies, and to be situated in one's Swarupa. So, Srila Prabhupada in the purport mentions several times this idea of licensing. So, in one sense, you could say that the material world is kind of like a big transcendental DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles, because if you want to operate any kind of vehicle, some automobile or some motorcycle or some 16-wheeler truck, you have to have the proper license. Or like if you want to be a pilot, you have to have a pilot's license. If you want to be the captain of a ship, you have to have a ship's captain's license. So to operate any kind of vehicle, you need the proper license. So to have the ability to operate the human vehicle, we have to have the proper license. The material body, it's described as a kind of machine that the soul is occupying. So to have the right to occupy and use that human form of life, one has to have the proper license. And if you misuse the human form of life in such a way as to harm yourself or harm other personalities, then you can lose your license, just like if somebody's driving a car very recklessly or under the influence of some intoxication. They will lose the privilege, they will lose the license for operating an automobile. So then they won't be able to get around with a car. They'll have to ride the bus or find some other way to get around. So we don't want to lose the license for the human form of life because then we're going to be in a less fortunate position. But even that is considered to be the grace of God. There's some supervising authority. It's described in the Vedic literature, karmana davanaitrena jantardeo papadyate, that we get our next body by superior arrangement. It says karmana, so it's partially, what kind of body is partially determined by our karma, our work in this life, but also daiva netrena, also by superior arrangement, we get our next form of life. So it's always up to the controlling power, ultimately. So that's why Srila Prabhupada says, whatever type of body one gets, that's the grace of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, ultimately. Because God could just put us in a state of suspended animation, like during the time when Brahma's life is over, all of the living entities, whatever type of body they're in, they enter at that time into the body of the Mahavishnu, where they're kept in a state of susupti, which means suspended animation. And that's actually being referred to in this verse, when it says, when the Supreme was lying in the water, all these functions remained suspended. So Krishna could keep us eternally in that state of suspended animation if he decided to do so. It's stated, Krishna Bahir Mukha Hana Bhogavanchakare Nikatashta Mayatare Japati Atare, that when a soul turns away from Krishna because of a desire to enjoy independently from Krishna, Maya is there to capture that soul. But Maya is working under the authority of Krishna. Maya Yakshena Prakriti Suyate Sacharacharam. Krishna states in the Bhagavad Gita, Maya is operating under my control. Ishvara Parama Krishna. There may be many controllers, but the supreme controller is Krishna. So, Krishna could keep us in a state of suspended animation forever. But out of his mercy, he allows us to act in such a way that we can fulfill our desires any way that we please. And he provides 8,400,000 different kinds of bodies for us to enjoy, try to enjoy separately from him. So each of those bodies is the grace of Krishna saying, okay, that's what you want. Here it is. Here's the opportunity to satisfy that. To satisfy that taste or desire that you may have. And if And Krishna is also simultaneously trying to give us every opportunity to develop the desire to return to Him. He is providing every facility for that. It's stated He is appearing in every species of life, trying to remind the soul. Krishna is Upadrashta Anumantascha. Krishna is overseeing and giving permission for the soul to enjoy separately from Him. Of course, the soul has to accept the reactions for doing that, but that is not what Krishna really desires. He desires that the soul return to Him. So for that purpose, Krishna within the heart acts as the Chaitya Guru, the Guru within the heart. And externally he appears as the spiritual master, the Diksha Guru, the Shiksha Gurus, the Vartma Pradarshika Guru, the Guru that initially shows the way to the path of devotional service and Krishna consciousness. So, and then Krishna also appears in the form of the Vedic literature. So he's giving every opportunity for us to use our intelligence to follow the proper path. So that is all the grace of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the grace of Krishna. So I'll stop there. Does anyone have any comments or question? Yes? Satchidananda Prabhu.
Thank you, Prabhu. From the purport, before I ask my questions, I want to read this. One who violates such controlling regulation has to be punished by degradation to a lower status of life. And at the end it says, in the purport at the end it says, a human being therefore must be on his guard as to what sort of body he's going to have in the next life. An irresponsible life of indiscrimination is risky, and that is the declaration of all scriptures. So my question is, I have a few friends who actually struggles with sex life, and a few of them, but this one in particular, already been married a couple times, had children, but he still wants to carry on with a third person, a third partner, and not having children. So, but at the same time, he wants to keep going with his sex life. And from the other side, if he doesn't take that responsibility, he feels that he's going to be just jumping from one person to person. So maybe just, even if it's a third time or fourth time, he still wants to do that. Now my question is, sometimes devotees might think that, might rationalize like this, chanting Hare Krishna, or eating prasadam, or association with devotees, at least I can have a human body. But according to this, it says that one who violates such controlling regulation has to be punished by degradation to a lower status of life. So my question is, will this be applicable to them too, or is just to anyone who doesn't have nothing to do with Krishna? And what advice could you give to these persons who are struggling with that?
Ultimately, these things are up to Krishna. as the super soul. It's up to him what's going to happen. If someone is performing devotional service, it's, in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna asks, Krishna the question, well, what happens to one who takes up this path of devotional service, but for one reason or another isn't successful in completing the process? And there Krishna says, well, they take birth in their next life in a human family and take up the process where they left off. So I think it depends quite a bit upon what the mentality of the person actually is. If they have one wife or husband, and while they're connected with that person, they are trying to follow the path of devotional service. Krishna says, kamosmi, I am sex life that is carried out according to the regulative principles. So if one is married and for some reason or another one goes to a second wife or husband and again tries to practice, then that may be one thing. If it's deliberate violation of the regulative principles just for selfish reasons, then there may be another procedure. Like it's explained that if a devotee is in Vrindavan or some other dham and violates the principles, then they may have to take one life in the body of a lower species, monkey or hog or some other species. So there are a lot of, when a devotee is involved, there are a lot of different considerations. What's in their heart, really. And only Krishna can judge these things. Ultimately, what their situation is and what the punishment or reaction to what they do is. It may be, another birth in a human form and another opportunity to take up the process of devotional service. It may be some birth in an animal species, but not in the same way that a non-devotee may experience, like going down to that lower species and then having to come up gradually again, maybe over millions of lifetimes to again have the human form. Not some limited time in a lower species. But that may happen in some cases. So ultimately it's up to Krishna and the soul. Something else? Okay, I think somebody over there had. He I'll come back to Maharaj.
Thank you very much for a wonderful class. Very insightful, very a nice oversight of this particular picture. In regard to such a nice question, if I understood it correctly. Is that a little better? Okay. Is that better? Yeah. In regard to his question, the thought that came to me, I just wanted to tack on to what you had mentioned, and that is that in the case of a very knowledgeable devotee, he's a Brahmin, and he's doing practices and so forth, and he intentionally, deliberately desires to break principles which he knows could give him some difficulties, but because he thinks he's very great, he's very wonderful, that Krishna will let him alone. He's punishable, but he won't be punished because of so many good things he has done. This is a false understanding, because the fact of the matter is, when one has knowledge, one has guidance, one knows what to do, and goes against that, then he's punished even more strongly, more severely. In fact, I've read it in the scripture somewhere, don't ask me where the quote is, but a Brahmin can become even punished more so than a Shudra, because Shudra doesn't really know what he should and should not do, whereas a Brahmin does know, and he violates that knowingly, and therefore, because it's done knowingly, he has to be taken care of. The ultimate result, though, is that even if he's punished, punishment means pain, punishment means suffering, punishment means difficulty. It could be mental punishment, it could be emotional punishment, it can be physical punishment, physiological punishment. These are all forms of punishment. So in any event, punishment is not likable, it's not desirable. You can't do very much when you are punished, and you can't make very much progress in a state of difficulty like that. So that's the devotee who's been taught. But then there's the non-devotee. So he gets punished also. And his punishment is also painful. And when he gets enough of these same pains over and over again, for example, he violates he's heard about it, but he doesn't take it seriously. No illicit sex, no intoxication, no meat. He's heard about that, but it doesn't register. So when he begins to get the different kinds of punishment, he begins to question, well, maybe there is some truth in this. Maybe it makes some sense. Let me stop doing this for a while and see if any difference in my life takes place. So he sees that when he stops doing certain things which go against the scriptures, there is not that kind of punishment that he was getting. It could be a fall, it could be headaches, it could be digestive problems. There are so many things, but things have gotten a little easier. So the main point that I want to make is that for a non-devotee, after a while he begins to dislike all the punishments. They're painful, they're upsetting, they're disturbing, and he decides that this isn't getting me anywhere. Let me try a different route. The other route, of course, is the spiritual route. So, in other words, we give up all of these things because we come to the conclusion or the realization that these things, when done, are against the law of God. They're against they're against the desire of God, and as a result of going against God, we suffer for that. And if I'm going to suffer and it's very painful and I don't like that and I can't have any peace, I might as well give them up. So giving them up is the result of realizing that they don't do us any good but only harm us, and therefore sometimes one by one we give them up. That's my understanding on those things.
Thank you, Maharaj. Thank you, Prabhu, for such a nice class. I know we're all hungry, so I hope you can give us a quick answer to my question. And this is in relation to a script I'm writing for TOVP, where we both do service. And it's also connected to my Kirtan service, where I encounter a lot of Mayavadi people who are attracted to Kirtan, but they still believe into this merging into the light, blah, blah, blah. And I was fascinated when you mentioned the state of suspension, susukti, what was it that you call it? That the jivas go to at the end of the yugas, and they go into this animated suspension state. I was wondering if you could elaborate more about that, because that reminds the Mayavadis a lot into this going back and merging into the body of God or the light. So how come when the jivas are being recycled in the universe, so to speak, they don't go back into Mahavishnu's body? they become like away from Mahavishnu but in a suspended animated state. I find that fascinating. It sounds very sci-fi movie-like. So if you could just elaborate a little bit more into why the jiva doesn't go back into Mahavishnu and comes back again, why it remains suspended somewhere else. That's really interesting to me. Thank you.
Okay. I'm speaking specifically about the end of the lifetime of Brahma, which is 311 trillion 40 billion years. The whole reason why there's Mahavishnu and the other types of Vishnus is that there are some souls that by their free will have decided they want to enjoy independently from Vishnu. So there has to be some other place besides the spiritual world for them to do that. And the only person who's capable of making such a place is Krishna himself. So the way that Krishna decides to do this is to manifest an expansion of himself, Mahavishnu. And even before that, there's other things. There's the first Chaturvyuha, the second, but ultimately Mahavishnu, who lies on the causal ocean in a state of dreaming, is the word that Srila Prabhupada uses. So he's lying in the causal ocean, sleeping, dreaming, and he's breathing in and out. And as he breathes out, unlimited universes expand from his body. And then he enters into each universe as Garbhodakshai Vishnu, and he also injects by his glance conditioned souls into each of those universes. So from Garbhodakshai Vishnu, in each of those expanded universes, he manifests as Brahma, the first demigod, who has the task of manifesting 8,400,000 kinds of bodies for conditioned souls to inhabit. And he also has the task of manifesting different planetary systems for them to exist on in those different kinds of bodies. And then at the end of each day of Brahma, the conditioned souls, they enter back into that lotus flower and into the body of Garbhodakshai Vishnu. And so that goes on again and again and again for 100 years of Brahma's life, which is equivalent to 311 trillion 40 billion years. And that's equivalent to a breath of Mahavishnu. So when Mahavishnu breathes out, the universes are manifested, the conditioned souls are placed in them, and they cycle through different days of Brahma. And then when Mahavishnu breathes in, then all those universes and all the souls in them re-enter the body of Mahavishnu. And so all those conditioned souls are in different bodies. So when Mahavishnu breathes in, they are placed in susupti, which is the state of suspended animation, deep dreamless sleep, within the body of Mahavishnu. Then when he breathes out, they're all placed in a universe in the form in which they were in their last life before that breath in, and then when they're breathed out again and injected into their universes, they get the form in which they were last living, until finally they, by the process of devotional service, get liberated. Of course, if they keep exercising their free will in the wrong way, they could remain eternally going through those cycles of birth and death. Hare Krishna. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.